Hello everyone, and welcome to the lecture on the range and xrange functions. In this lecture we'll see how to use the range function and the differences between the range and xrange functions. We use the range function to create a list of numbers. For instance, I can say range and then pass, let's say 4. So this will create a list of numbers from 0 to 3. Let me run it and show you. So now we have a list of numbers from 0 to 3. So if we pass the range function and then pass n, that will create a list of numbers from 0 to n minus 1, where n is a positive integer, right? So that's the range function. Similarly, I can say range and then 22. This will create a list of numbers from 0 to 21. So by default, the range function will give you a list starting from 0. However, we can change that initial point by passing another number. For instance, we can say range from 4 to 10, for example. In this case, we'll get a list of numbers from 4 to 9. So if we run that, we get 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So if we pass a starting point, the range function will start from that number. Otherwise, it will start from the default value from the default 0. Similarly, we can say range, let's say from 3 to 11. This will give us a list of numbers from 3 to 10. Right, starting point 3 and ending point will be 11 minus 1, which is 10. So that's the range function, and we can store our result in a variable. Let's say list1, and we can call our list1 object. So we have a list of numbers from 3 to 10. Another thing we can do is we can pass a starting point, which is our initial number, and then we have our final, and then we can also pass what is known as step size. Step size means in how many steps do we want our list to be. For instance, we can say range, and then I want a list of numbers from, let's say, 5 to 25 in step sizes of 2, for example. So this will give me a list of every other number from 5 to 25. So the list will look like 5 and then 7, 9, all the way to 23, right? So this is a step size. We can do that. And here, if I change this to, let's say, in step sizes of 10, I will only get 5 and 15, right? Similarly, I can say in step sizes of 4 and gives you 5. 5 plus 4 is 9, plus 4, 13, and so on. So the range function is mainly used to create a list of numbers, and we can save that in some variable and then use that variable. You'll see the range function used a lot with for loops. We have a section on for loops in the future. We'll look at that, but just to give you an overview, we can say for I in range, let's say 5, print I. So we have already seen what this range function will do. So this will create a list of numbers from 0 to 4, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. What this for loop does is that it will go to each of the elements in our range and then print those elements. So not to make it confusing, let me use the variable number. So for number in our range, print each of the numbers. So if we run that, we get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Don't worry about this. We have a section dedicated entirely for loops. We'll see a lot of this, but I just wanted to give you an example of how we can use the range function with for loops. It's a very common usage, range function in for loops. Okay, so main use of the range function is to create a list of numbers, and the range function can be used in Python 2 and Python 3. However, in Python 2 we have another function known as the xrange function. The xrange function is unique to Python 2. We don't have the xrange function in Python 3. So what this xrange function does is that it returns an xrange object, and this is a generator object, and we use those generator objects to generate numbers whenever we need. So for instance, if I say xrange and then pass 6 and run it, we get an xrange object. So if we check the type of this xrange object, we'll see that it's of data type xrange. So you'll see the difference if you are using a large list of numbers. For instance, if I say range, let's say 4 to 100,000. So if I call this range function, it will give me a list of numbers from 4 to 100,000 minus 1, right? So 4, 5, 6, all the way to 99,999. And that, as you can imagine, will take a lot of space in memory, right? It will occupy a lot of space in memory. Whereas if we call the xrange function, that will only give us an xrange object. Okay, so if I call that, it will give us an xrange object. It won't give us all of that list. But we can use this xrange object, and then we can, so let me show you the type of this object. It's an xrange object. We can use this xrange object to generate the numbers that we want when we want it. This is called this is a generator object, and we also have another section on generators and iterators, and in that section we look in depth about generation and iteration. But I wanted to quickly show you the difference between the xrange and range functions. So xrange function only exists in Python 2, and we use this xrange function in case we deal with a larger list of numbers. For instance, if this was 1 million, 10 million, 100 million, we would use the xrange function instead of the range function, right? As you see, it occupies a lot of space in memory. No xrange function in Python 3. But does that mean we cannot perform this in Python 3? The answer is we can. So when we use the range function in Python 3, it does what the range and xrange functions do in Python 2. So range in Python 3 is equal to range and xrange in Python 2. So that's the difference. So if you are using the range function in Python 3, you have to specify which one to use. You have to let your Python 3 know that you want to generate a range of numbers, but not, an iterable object. In that case, if you are using the range function in Python 3 to create a list of objects, you have to include the list method and then pass your range function, for instance list and then range 10. So this will create a list of numbers from 0 to 9. Okay, so don't forget to cast your range object into a list if you are using Python 3. So list and then range, let's say 3. So you'll have to cast your object into a list. And if you want to use step size, it's the same thing. Let's say list range for step sizes, so starting point and then ending point, let's say 28 in step sizes of 3, for instance. So you'll have to cast your object into a list if you want to use the range function in Python 3, since the range function does both xrange and range. Okay, that's how you can create a list by using the range function in Python 3, casting it into a list, since the range function does both creating a list containing numbers and also iterating by using xrange. So that's the difference between range and xrange functions. And usually, if we are dealing with small lists of numbers like this, range 22, these are small lists and they don't occupy much space in memory. So in those cases, we use range functions. Whereas if we are dealing with a larger set of numbers, a larger list. So to summarize, we saw how to use the range function to create a list of numbers. And we can also specify where our range function can start and end by passing an initial value for our list to start and a final value. And we also saw that we can pass a step size value so that we can create the list as we want it. For example, here we created a list of numbers from 5 to 25 in step sizes of 4. And we saw that there is another method called xrange in Python 2. Thank you everyone, and see you at the next lecture.